I spent 5 years caring for my sick husband, feeding him, bathing him, holding his hand through every appointment. I gave up everything for him. After he died, I sat in that lawyer's office expecting closure, but instead I heard a stranger's name. Sabrina, his affair. He left her everything, the house, the money, the life I built. But what he didn't know, he forgot to change one clause. My name is Quinn Avery. I'm 38 years old. For the last 5 years, my world was the size of our 2-story bungalow. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was a slow shrinking, a gradual closing in of the walls until all I could see was the life contained within them. My husband, Graham Turner, was sick. It wasn't a quick, dramatic illness like you see in the movies. It was a long, slow erosion, a chipping away at the man he used to be and at the woman I was. It ate away at him and it ate away at me. I remember the day I quit my job at the small accounting office. I was good at it. I liked the quiet order of numbers. They made sense. My salary, $58,000 a year, wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. It became a memory, a line item from a previous life, traded for a new career with no pay and no holidays. Our life became a meticulously scheduled routine of pill trays, their little plastic compartments snapping open and shut like the ticking of a clock counting down to nothing. There were doctor's appointments that filled the calendar, the sterile smell of clinic waiting rooms clinging to my clothes. And there was the constant, low hum of the oxygen machine in the bedroom, a sound that became the soundtrack to my sleepless nights. I'd lie awake, listening to its rhythm, listening to his breathing, convincing myself that his silence was just a symptom of the pain. His impatience, his flashes of anger, they were just fear, I told myself. A man afraid of his own body betraying him. It was a story I repeated to myself so often I almost believed it. My savings account, once a small cushion of comfort, now holds $612. That's the final tally. That's what 5 years of unwavering devotion cost. He passed away on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. I was in the kitchen, the blender whirring as I pureed his chicken soup so he could swallow it. The silence from the bedroom was what alerted me. The hum of the machine was gone, and so was he. The funeral felt like a play I hadn't rehearsed for. I stood near the casket, a prop in the center of the stage, playing the part of the grieving widow. The role felt hollow, the costume of a simple black dress hanging loosely on a frame I no longer recognized as my own. People I hadn't seen in years filed past, their faces a blur of pity. They offered condolences, their hands patting my arm with a soft, meaningless touch. Their eyes told the real story. They were filled with a kind of sad admiration for the woman who gave up everything for her dying husband, the martyr, the saint. I wanted to scream that I was neither. I was just tired. I saw a woman I didn't know standing in the back of the room, partially hidden by a large floral arrangement. She was immaculate. Perfect, subtle makeup, a black dress that hugged her body in a way that spoke of quiet expense, costing more than my monthly grocery budget. She never approached me, never offered a single word. She just watched. At one point, she dabbed her eyes with a delicate handkerchief, but her tears looked different from mine. Mine were the dry, burning tears of pure exhaustion. Hers looked like a performance, a carefully curated display of sorrow. Graham's brother, a man I'd always found shallow, gave a eulogy about Graham's zest for life. I almost laughed out loud. The man he described, full of adventure and laughter, was a ghost from a decade ago. I hadn't seen that zest in years, hadn't heard that laugh. It was buried under layers of resentment and pain. Then one of Graham's old college friends got up and mentioned his frequent business trips over the past few years and how much he'd be missed by his colleagues around the country. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I didn't remember any business trips. In my world, in the small bungalow that had become my entire life, those trips were for experimental treatments, for consultations with specialists in other states. Or so he had told me. The office of the probate attorney, a man named Charles Morton, was cold. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the atmosphere. It smelled of old paper and stale coffee, the scent of endings and disputes. I sat in a stiff leather chair that creaked every time I shifted, my hands clenched in my lap. I expected little. Honestly, I didn't even know why I was there. Maybe a thank you, a small acknowledgement written into the document. Something, anything, to prove that the last 5 years of my life weren't just a figment of my imagination, a service rendered and forgotten. I just wanted to see my name. The woman from the funeral was already there, sitting opposite me. She looked up as I entered, her expression a strange mix of sympathy and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "I'm Sabrina Cole," she said, her voice soft and smooth. She was a friend of Graham's. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Charles Morton, a man with a gray face and even grayer suit, cleared his throat with a dry rustle. He began to read from the document in a monotone voice, never once looking at me. He didn't seem to see me at all. I was just part of the furniture. Then he read her name. "To Sabrina Cole, I leave my home at 124 Willow Creek Lane." The words hung in the airless room. My home, the place where I'd changed his bandages and held his hand through fevers. It was her house now. He read her name again, the sound of it like a hammer blow. "To Sabrina Cole, I leave my investment account valued at $1,240,000. The lake cabin we bought for our 10th anniversary, the one with the porch overlooking the water. The vintage car he polished every Sunday before he got sick. Everything, all of it to her. My name was never mentioned, not once. It wasn't that I was left a small, insulting sum. I was simply gone, as if I had never existed. I wasn't his wife. I was an oversight. I walked back into the house, her house, apparently in a complete daze. The key felt heavy and foreign in my hand. Inside, the silence was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. It was the empty, echoing silence of a place that no longer belonged to me. The only proof that the last 5 years had even happened were the faint indents on the bedroom carpet where the hospital bed used to be. They were pale, crushed patches, a map of my servitude. I ran my fingers over them. This was the only trace I'd left. Every object felt alien, tainted. The photos on the wall of a smiling, younger Graham and me felt like a cruel joke, a lie preserved under glass. Who were those people? This was the immediate, crushing obstacle. I was homeless, broke with only $600 to my name, and completely erased from the life I had sacrificed everything to maintain. My goal just moments before had been to get through the day. Now it was more primal, survive. But how? Where would I go? What would I do? I started searching Graham's office, not for money, not anymore. I was searching for a reason. An explanation. Some piece of paper that would tell me I wasn't a complete and utter fool for believing in him, for loving him, for dedicating my life to his comfort. I pulled books off shelves, opened drawers filled with neat stacks of paper, looking for anything that felt like it belonged to our life together, not just his. I spent hours in Graham's office, a room that had become his sanctuary and my no-go zone during his illness. It was the one room I rarely entered. He'd said he needed it to manage his medical paperwork, but now, seeing it, I realized it was a fortress. It smelled of him, that faint, spicy scent of his cologne mixed with the dust of forgotten files. I found statements for stocks I didn't know he owned, meticulously organized in color-coded folders. There were receipts for credit cards I'd never seen, with balances that made my stomach churn. It was like sorting through the belongings of a stranger, a man who just happened to sleep down the hall from me for 15 years, a man whose soup I had pureed just yesterday. I wasn't looking for assets anymore. I was looking for a narrative, a clue, an old diary, a misplaced letter, a hastily scribbled note, anything to make sense of a betrayal so complete, so absolute, it felt unreal. Instead, I found the meticulous, chilling records of a life lived entirely without me, in parallel to the one I was tending to. My grief, which had been a dull, heavy ache, was curdling into something colder, sharper, anger. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about the calculated deception. He had used his illness, my devotion, as a curtain to hide behind while he built another world with another woman. He had been sick, yes. I had the medical bills to prove it, but he hadn't been absent from life. He was just somewhere else. In the back of his heavy oak filing cabinet, wedged behind a thick stack of old tax returns from a decade ago, my fingers brushed against a thick, navy blue binder. It was heavy, substantial. I pulled it out, blowing a layer of dust off the cover. The label on the spine was printed in his neat, architectural handwriting, the kind of lettering he used for blueprints back when he was an architect. It read, "Turner Family Trust." I remembered it then, but only vaguely, like a dream. We'd set it up years ago, long before he got sick. It was his idea, a way to organize our assets to be responsible adults, he'd said. It was one of the last things we did together as a team, sitting in a lawyer's office, signing papers that bound our futures together. Or so I thought. I carried the binder to his wide mahogany desk and sat in his leather chair. It still held the faint impression of his body. My hands trembled as I opened the dusty cover. It felt like an artifact from a different civilization, a life where we were partners. Inside, the pages were crisp and official. There were copies of deeds to the house and the cabin, lists of account numbers for our investments, and page after page of dense legal language that made my head spin. It was a complete catalog of the life he had just given away. I skimmed through the pages, my eyes blurring with exhaustion and unshed tears. It all seemed standard, a boring but necessary collection of financial details. Then my eyes landed on a section titled Trustee Powers and Provisions. It sounded important, official. I forced myself to focus, to read the words one by one. My finger, tracing the lines of text, stopped on a single paragraph. Unlike the rest of the document, it was simple, direct, and written in a way that even I, in my state of shock, could understand perfectly. It said that I, Quinn Avery, was the sole trustee of the Turner Family Trust. It stated in no uncertain terms that any and all changes to the beneficiaries or the distribution of assets required my signature. Not just my signature, it was more specific than that. My signature, witnessed by a third party and officially notarized. My heart started to beat a little faster. I flipped through the rest of the binder, my hands no longer trembling but moving with a new purpose. Tucked in the back were several amendments, pages he had clearly drafted with his lawyer. They were dated over the past 2 years. Each one meticulously detailed his wish to remove me and name Sabrina Cole as the sole beneficiary of everything. But at the bottom of each and every page, the signature line for the trustee, for me, was blank. I sat there for a full minute, maybe more, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed impossibly loud. He hadn't just forgotten to thank me in his will. He had forgotten to legally erase me. The most crucial step in his grand plan, the one thing that made it all binding, he had overlooked. It wasn't a tidal wave of victory that washed over me. It was something much quieter, much more profound. It was a single, steadying breath, the first truly deep breath I had taken in 5 years. The ground beneath my feet, which had vanished in that attorney's office, slowly began to solidify. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving automatically. I didn't call my mom or my dad. I didn't want to hear their pity, their anger on my behalf. I needed something else. I opened the internet browser and typed estate lawyers near me. A list appeared. I scanned the names, looking for something that felt right. My eyes stopped on one, Mason Reed. His website was simple, professional. It said he specialized in complex trust and estate disputes. It was as if the universe had handed me a business card. I dialed the number, my heart thumping a steady rhythm against my ribs. A calm, professional voice answered. Mason Reed's office. I cleared my throat, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. My husband passed away, I said, the words clinical and detached. I think he made a mistake on his will. I need to schedule a meeting. Mason Reed's office was the opposite of the probate attorney's grim little room. It was on the top floor of a modern glass building with light pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows. The air smelled of fresh coffee and clean paper, not defeat. Mason Reed, an estate lawyer who now represented my only hope, was younger than I expected, maybe in his early 40s, with kind, intelligent eyes and a direct way of speaking that I appreciated immediately. He didn't offer pity or platitudes, just a firm handshake and a cup of coffee in a heavy ceramic mug. I sat across the wide, uncluttered desk from him and told him the story. I laid it all out in a flat, even voice, refusing to let emotion creep in. The illness, the 5 years of caregiving, the funeral, the will reading, Sabrina, and then the binder. I pushed the thick, navy blue trust document across the polished surface of his desk and opened it to the page, pointing to the clause about the trustee's signature. He read it, then leaned back in his chair and read it again. He was silent for a long time, his face completely unreadable as his eyes scanned the text. My entire future seemed to hang in that silence. Finally, he looked up, his gaze meeting mine directly. "He never got your signature," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He didn't." Mason leaned forward, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Then he didn't change anything," he said simply. "The will is a wish list. This document, the trust, is the law. You're still in control, Mrs. Avery, of everything." Mason explained the next steps in plain English without any of the complicated legal jargon that was designed to confuse and intimidate. He said we could file an immediate injunction. He called it a legal stop sign, a powerful one. It would freeze every single asset held within the trust. The house couldn't be sold. The money in the $1.24 million investment account couldn't be touched. The vintage car in the garage couldn't be transferred to Sabrina's name. Nothing could move, nothing could be accessed or sold by anyone until a court officially acknowledged my authority as the sole trustee. It was a way of pressing pause on Graham's plan, of stopping Sabrina from claiming her prize before the fight had even begun. He drafted the necessary paperwork right there while I sat, the coffee growing cold in my hands. The words on the pages were a blur of legal phrases, but I understood their meaning. They were a declaration of war. He turned the documents around on his desk and handed me a heavy black pen. "This will start the fight," he warned me, his kind eyes serious. "There's no going back from this." I looked down at the pen, at the crisp white paper, at the line waiting for my name. "The fight started when he died," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I'm just fighting back now." My signature wasn't shaky or uncertain. It was the steadiest my hand had been in 5 years. With that single stroke of ink, I felt my spine, which had been bent under the weight of grief and betrayal, straighten into a rod of steel. It took less than a day for the first shot to be fired in return. Mason's official notice reached Sabrina's lawyer, and my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the answer button, but I couldn't bring myself to hear her voice. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, a notification popped up. The message was from her. Her voice, when I finally listened to it, was syrupy sweet, dripping with a feigned, confused innocence. "Quinn, it's Sabrina," she began. "There must be some kind of terrible misunderstanding. I think our lawyers are getting things twisted. Graham wanted me to have the house, he told me so many times. She suggested we talk, just the two of us, like adults, without the lawyers involved. She painted herself as the victim of a complicated legal mistake, the true love of Graham's life caught in a web of red tape. She mentioned Graham's wishes over and over, as if repeating them would make them legally binding. As if his desires trumped the law. The phrase that made my stomach clench was when she said, with a little tremor in her voice, "This is what he would have wanted." She was trying to weaponize my grief, my presumed loyalty to his memory. I listened to the entire message without expression, then my finger moved to the screen and I deleted it without a second thought. My fight wasn't with her, it was with his ghost, and she was just a pawn. When I didn't respond to her call, the tone of her messages changed dramatically. The sweetness curdled into something ugly and raw. A text message appeared on my phone an hour later. "You can't do this, Graham loved me. You were just his nurse." Another one followed quickly after. "You're just a bitter old woman trying to steal what's mine. Everyone knows he stopped loving you years ago. She was trying to find a weak spot to poke and prod at the wounds she assumed were still bleeding. She threatened to tell everyone we knew how I'd let him waste away, how I was cold and uncaring in his final months. She promised to drag my name through the mud to make sure the whole town knew I was nothing but a greedy, vengeful hag. Then came the official letter from her attorney, a man named Victor Lang. It arrived via courier, a thick, intimidating envelope. This wasn't a childish, emotional threat, it was a promise written on expensive letterhead. They were preparing a lawsuit to contest my position as trustee, claiming I was unfit to serve. They were demanding the full transfer of the estate to Sabrina, plus an additional $2 million in damages for the emotional distress caused by my actions. I read the letter, then read it again. The audacity of it was breathtaking. I took a picture of it with my phone and forwarded it to Mason. My only comment was a single sentence: "Let her try." While Mason handled the storm of legal threats from Victor Lang, I started digging into the estate's finances. As trustee, I now had the legal right to access everything. Every bank account, every credit card statement, every investment portfolio. It was my duty, Mason said, to understand the full scope of the trust's assets. I began with Graham's credit cards. As I scrolled through months of online statements, a recurring monthly charge caught my eye. $189 every month for the last 3 years, paid to a local self-storage facility. I had no idea he was renting a storage unit. When I'd asked him about the boxes piling up in the garage years ago, he'd told me he was getting rid of old junk, taking it to the dump. Apparently, he'd been taking it somewhere else entirely. I went back to his office, to the mahogany desk where I'd found the trust binder. In the top right drawer, tucked away in an envelope marked spares, I found a small collection of keys. One of them was a single, unlabeled key with a plastic fob, the kind used for storage units. I drove to the facility, a sterile, anonymous place with endless rows of bright orange roll-up doors baking under the afternoon sun. I found the unit number from the credit card statement, C27. The key slid into the lock and with a satisfying click, it turned smoothly. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the cold, corrugated metal of the door. Whatever was in here, whatever he'd been paying to hide for 3 years, he hadn't wanted me to see it. I took a deep breath and pulled the door up. The air that rushed out was stale and smelled like secrets. The unit wasn't filled with junk. It wasn't old college textbooks or broken furniture. It was a museum of his other life. A life I had paid for but was never invited to see. There were boxes stacked against the wall, and I opened the first one. It was filled with photo albums. Graham and Sabrina in Paris, laughing by the Eiffel Tower, her arm looped through his. The date printed on the back of the photo was from the spring of 2 years ago, a time he told me he was flying to a clinic in another state for an experimental treatment. There was another photo of them on a boat, both tanned and smiling, the sun sparkling on the water behind them. That one was taken on a weekend I spent awake for 48 straight hours, refilling his oxygen tanks and crushing his pills into applesauce because he was too weak to swallow them. There were clothes in the unit, expensive suits of his I'd never seen before, and a few of her dresses hanging carefully in a garment bag, as if ready for their next getaway. Tucked inside a shoebox was a small velvet ring box from a high-end jeweler downtown. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. Inside, there wasn't a ring, but there was a folded receipt, a diamond ring. $9,800. He wasn't just having an affair. He was building a completely separate life, a whole world designed for the two of them. He hadn't just been dying from a disease. He'd been actively, methodically escaping a life with me. The proof didn't break me, it didn't even make me cry. Standing under the single, buzzing, fluorescent light of that storage unit, it forged me. Any lingering softness I had toward his memory, any shred of pity, vanished. Back at home, the evidence was spread across my dining room table. The photos of their smiling faces, the receipt for the diamond ring. They were artifacts of a massive betrayal. With a cold, methodical calm, I dove into years of bank statements. The storage unit was just the tip of the iceberg. The money, as always, told the real story. I found a series of large, regular transfers to a limited liability company I didn't recognize. A quick search online revealed it was the registered business name for Sabrina's little boutique downtown. He had been paying her shop's rent for 2 years. He had bought her display furniture, her starting inventory, her point-of-sale system. I tallied it up, a total of $42,300. There were other things, smaller but just as damning. Hotel stays at luxury resorts, expensive dinners, airline tickets booked in their names. All of it paid for from our joint accounts, the same accounts I had stopped looking at years ago to save myself the anxiety of watching our savings drain away on his medical costs. He was siphoning our shared future into her present. He wasn't just erasing me from his will, he had been actively robbing me for years, using me as the unwitting financier for his affair. My accounting background, the skills I'd let go dormant while I played nurse, came roaring back to life. I opened my laptop, created a new spreadsheet, and began to document every dollar, every single betrayal. The spreadsheet was a roadmap of his lies, a ledger of my own foolishness. Each line item was a fresh stab of betrayal. A withdrawal of $5,000 labeled medical supplies in his notes corresponded perfectly with the date on a receipt for a weekend at a luxury spa for 2. A check written for home repairs for a leaky roof we never had matched to the dollar, a payment to the jeweler who sold him the diamond ring for Sabrina. He used his illness as the perfect cover story. Who would question a dying man's expenses? Who would dare pry into the costs of his fight for life? It was brilliant in its cruelty. I worked late into the night, the only light in the house coming from my laptop screen, the numbers glowing in the dark. I calculated the total. The money he had secretly funneled to her business, to their life together, all drawn from our shared funds, came to over $70,000. It was money that could have paid for a better in-home nurse, giving me a night off, a chance to breathe. It was money that could have kept my own personal savings account from dwindling to practically nothing. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was a calculated, long-term theft orchestrated by my husband. He didn't just give her our assets after he died. He made me pay for their life together while he was still alive. This was the final, hard proof. I wasn't just outmatched, I was the bankroll for my own replacement. I looked at the completed spreadsheet, at the mountain of cold, hard evidence laid out in neat rows and columns. My first instinct, the one screaming from the most tired, broken part of me, was to just take the money and disappear. Mason had told me I could. I had the legal right as trustee. I could liquidate every asset, the investment account, the cabin, the car, put every last cent into an account under my name and walk away. I could move to a new city, buy a little house, and never look back. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt too easy, too quiet. It would be a silent victory, one that let Graham's memory remain intact to the outside world. He would still be the tragic victim of a long illness. And it would let Sabrina style herself as the wronged lover, the heartbroken soulmate robbed of her inheritance by a bitter, greedy wife. This wasn't about getting rich. It was about correcting the record. It was about reclaiming the truth of the last 5 years of my life. My revenge couldn't be silent. It had to be precise, public, and permanent. I didn't just want to win the lawsuit. I wanted to redefine his legacy. And as I sat there staring at the screen, I realized the trust gave me more than just control over the money. It gave me control over his name. That was the major truth that flipped my entire plan on its head. I wasn't just the trustee of his assets, I was the curator of his memory. I called Mason the next morning and laid out my new plan. He was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment after I finished. "That's unconventional, Quinn," he said finally, a note of surprise in his voice. "But it's entirely within your rights as trustee." I wasn't just going to take the money. I was going to redirect it, using his name to fund the very things that would have made him furious. First, I would allocate a significant portion of the estate to local charities, but not just any charities. I chose the County Women's Shelter, a place that provided refuge for women who, like me, suddenly found themselves with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Then I chose a new local fund that had just been started, one that provided money for caregiver respite, giving relief to people who had lost themselves while caring for others. The donations would be large, they would be public, and most importantly, they would be made in the name of the Graham Turner Memorial Fund with me, his loving widow, as the sole administrator. His name, the one he had tried so hard to protect, would forever be associated with supporting the very women he had betrayed and abandoned. It was a legacy he would have absolutely hated. This was my irreversible choice. I was no longer just defending my assets, I was seizing his narrative and rewriting it from the ground up. I started with the things that belonged to them, not to me. The realtor I called was brisk and practical. She smelled faintly of lemon and wore shoes that clicked like a metronome. She came by on a Tuesday, walked through the cabin as if she already knew how she'd stage it, and said it would sell fast. It did. 2 weeks later, after open houses and a string of polite offers, the lake cabin was sold for $286,000. I remember standing on its little porch the last morning, the air sharp and cold, the lake a sheet of quicksilver. I ran my hand over the railing whose paint I'd once promised to touch up, and I thought of the photos in the storage unit of them laughing on that very dock. Selling it felt like taking back a scene from a play he'd written for someone else. The Mustang was easier to let go. He had polished it every Sunday until the paint shone like glass. It sat in the garage like a sleeping animal, its leather smelling faintly of him and old motor oil. I took it to a collector who kissed the paint, counted out cash, and drove off with a satisfied smile. $28,000. I watched the taillights disappear and felt a lightness I'd almost forgotten existed. The house, though my house, stayed. I locked the front door behind me and for the first time in years felt entitled to the click of that lock. I sent the sales figures to Mason and let him handle the paperwork. When Sabrina's lawyer sent his first furious letter demanding I stop, Mason sent back a copy of the trust with my signature circled in black ink. I could picture the look on Victor Lang's face when he realized the signatures that mattered were missing. He could rage all he wanted. Legally, he had nothing to stand on. Still, his letters were loud, full of threats and promises of escalation. I read them and folded them carefully before tucking them into a drawer. I didn't need to fan my anger, it burned steady inside me. Opening the cabin sale check felt oddly ceremonial. I didn't deposit it right away. Instead, I wrote the numbers into my spreadsheet, balanced the columns, and felt the order of my life return in small, sensible strokes. The money wasn't for me to splurge on revenge. I had a plan, and the plan required careful bookkeeping. I wasn't just returning what had been stolen, I was redirecting where his name would land, and that work demanded precise hands. I called Mason and told him to start the steps for charitable transfers. Then I drove to the shelter to meet Linda Carr and to get my hands dirty in the way I knew best, by showing up. The idea of a bookstore cafe was a soft thing in my chest that had thudded quietly for years. With a portion of the funds, I decided it wouldn't stay a dream. I started looking at small spaces on the coast, taking photos with my phone and sketching layouts on napkins in coffee shops. The bookstore would be light and honest, not a monument to anything but good books and warm coffee. During a visit to the women's shelter just to talk about the donation, I met Jenna Price. She was 26, with a toddler's backpack slung over one shoulder and a look that mixed exhaustion with fierce intelligence. She told me she wanted to get back on her feet. She wanted steady hours. She wanted a life that didn't end at a daycare pickup time. We sat in the shelter's kitchen drinking bad coffee while Linda made calls in the corner. I watched Jenna speak about her plans in a voice that tightened around hope like a rubber band, and I remembered that feeling myself before I married Graham, the small, stubborn ambition to make something of my own. I offered her a job on the spot, to help me build the bookstore, to learn the ropes of running a small business, to be my first manager. She stared at me like I'd handed her a miracle and then burst into tears, quick and bewildered. I laughed until I cried too. It felt right. It felt like the beginning of something that would outlast both of them. Then the lawsuit papers arrived. A courier came to my door with a thick envelope, and the weight of it made my stomach drop. Victor Lang had filed suit. The papers were neat, aggressive, legal-sounding, but their intention was simple: to scare me into giving up. They called it an action to contest trustee authority and demanded the full estate plus $2 million in damages. The document had a tone of practiced outrage. It accused me of exerting undue influence over Graham in his final years, of isolating him and manipulating his choices. They said my grief and long isolation made me mentally unfit to serve as trustee. It was written as if my life of quiet caregiving was evidence of control, as if my presence at his bedside was a crime. I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice, then again, feeling a clammy heat rise in my neck. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and money. Mason came over the next morning, read it with his hands folded, and told me not to let their words get to me. "It's theater," he said plainly. "They're trying to shape public opinion and scare you into settling. We have the trust, we have the evidence." He was steady in a way I needed, but even he admitted the other side was playing for keeps. Their goal wasn't just the assets, it was to make me look small, petty, and unworthy in the eyes of the people we both knew. The social pressure began almost immediately. A woman I hadn't heard from in years called, her voice bright with false concern. "Quinn," she said, and for a second I thought it was an offer of help. Instead, she began retelling Sabrina's version of events like a news anchor reciting talking points. Graham wanted to leave things to Sabrina. He told me personally that she was the one he was happiest with. "Don't you think you should?" Her tone slid into an almost cruel pity. She suggested gently that maybe I was holding on to things out of spite. She implied that going to trial would only make me look vindictive. I told her I appreciated her call and put the phone down with my hands shaking. The call hurt because it wasn't just Sabrina who was trying to rewrite the story. It was everyone who wanted the easy narrative. People preferred the romance of a lover left behind than the messy truth of a marriage that had decayed. The friend didn't call again. I realized then that the social war would be as draining as the legal one. It would require choices about who to answer and who to let talk. Word spread at a slow, poisonous pace. Someone posted a version of Sabrina's story on an online community group, and the phrase "poor devastated girlfriend" began appearing in comments. I felt the old instinct rise, to hide, to slip away where no one could point and whisper. Instead, I chose to be deliberate. I met with Linda Carr at the shelter and announced the first major donation, $120,000 to the shelter's emergency fund. I wanted their needs met right away: money to pay last month's rent for a young mother, to cover transportation for court dates, to put gas in the cars of women fleeing bad situations. Linda cried when I handed over the oversized banker's check. She squeezed my hand as if I were family. We arranged for the local paper to run a story. It was short, plain, and kind. The headline read, "Graham Turner Memorial Fund established to support local women." They ran a photo of Linda and me standing in front of the shelter, me wrapped in a gray coat, Linda in a sweater that had seen better days. The public reaction surprised me. People left comments, grateful notes from women who called the shelter and said they could finally afford a motel room for a night, a reader who thanked me for honoring the memory of someone she'd never met by supporting people in need. The donations softened the narrative Sabrina was trying to sell. If people saw Graham's name attached to Help for Women, would they still buy the story that I was a greedy, vindictive widow? I followed the shelter gift with another check, $75,000, to a caregiver respite fund. It was a small, local program that paid for a few hours of trained caregiving so unpaid caregivers could rest. I had needed that myself 1,000 times over. The article that followed was quieter but just as effective. People started to call the shelter to ask how they could help. Mothers who had once tutored me in math called with offers of homemade casseroles and prayers. The donations were public, handled with transparency and care. Each headline, each photograph, each story nudged the narrative in a different direction. It didn't erase the lies, but it showed a different truth, that the man they'd mourned was leaving behind resources for people who needed them, and that his widow was using his name for good. Sabrina and her lawyer responded the way I'd expected, angry letter after angry letter accusing me of dissipating assets and acting in bad faith. They warned that these public gifts would be evidence of my intent to dispossess her. Victor Lang's letters grew more theatrical, each one a little thinner on facts and thicker on bluster. But the shelter's phones rang with new calls from women who needed help. Linda sent me a short text that said simply, "They moved a family out of a motel tonight. They called us because of your gift." That message was better than any headline could be. It reminded me why I hadn't chosen the easy path. The money was already doing what I wanted it to do, changing lives and piece by piece, changing the story people would remember. As I sorted through the last of Graham's business mail, I felt like a grave robber. Only the graves were stacks of papers and the bones were polite signatures. Most of it was routine, appeals from clients, invoices for things I didn't recognize. Then a thin envelope slipped from between two folders and landed at my feet like an accusation. The return address was from a well-known local real estate office. I picked it up with a palm that wasn't steady and felt the paper between my fingers, warm from my body heat. The date on the letter was 3 months before he died. I read it twice and then a third time, as if repeating the words would change them. It was a follow-up note, friendly at first, thanking him for meeting and outlining the agreed-upon listing strategy. They talked about curb appeal, suggested repairs, and recommended a timeline. There it was, plain as a map. A plan to put our bungalow on the market within 60 days of his passing. They even suggested a timeline for staging, an agent to coordinate showings, and a projected selling price. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon from the cleaning wipes that had been used on the office desk. My throat closed. He'd been planning this while I measured his medication bottles and counted pills. He'd been talking to strangers about how to make me leave my own home. When I folded the letter, the crease cut through my fingers like a small, bright pain. It wasn't just a note, it was a forecast of my erasure. The subtle, methodical way he had arranged for my displacement stunned me more than any photograph from the storage unit. This was no whim. This was a plan. I sat down on the edge of our bed and let the letter rest in my lap while the room spun slowly like a carousel I no longer wanted to ride. A few days later, hidden beneath a stack of realtor pamphlets, I found something else, a draft letter on his personal letterhead addressed to me. It was clinical and cold, the sort of thing you might expect from a bank or a landlord. He had written that upon his death, the property would be transferred to a new owner and politely requested that I vacate the premises within 30 days to allow for a smooth transition. He even listed a moving company he recommended, complete with a phone number and an estimate for a 2-bedroom move. Reading his handwriting across the top, his looping, familiar script, felt like someone handing me a stranger's instructions for how to leave my own life. He'd scripted my exit as if I were a character in one of his architectural plans, measured, annotated, and disposable. The cruelty of it was surgical. There was no apology, no softness. It was logistical. He'd planned how to make me homeless and made it appear reasonable, courteous even. I stared at the letter until the ink blurred. There was a part of me that wanted to laugh at the absurdity, at the neatness of it all, but the laughter died before it reached my mouth. Instead, I folded the draft carefully and put it in an envelope with the real estate agent's note. The two of them together felt like evidence and indictment both. I slid them into a file labeled evidence and with shaking fingers made a copy. I put the original in a safe deposit box at the small bank downtown, the same bank where we'd once argued about interest rates over burned toast and coffee. I signed the safe deposit agreement like I was sealing the past away. Holding the copies later that night, I realized this wasn't just about money or property anymore. The letters showed intention. He hadn't just made a mistake or acted out in weakness, he had planned my removal. He assumed grief would flatten me, that sorrow would be my resignation letter. That assumption was the fuel I needed. I didn't let the anger roar, I let it simmer and sharpen into purpose. I took a photograph of the eviction draft and sent it to Mason with a note. He planned this, we need to use it. When Mason called me a week later, his voice was level and businesslike. They're offering to settle, he said without preamble. He told me Victor Lang had put an offer on the table. If I accepted, Sabrina would drop the lawsuit immediately. I would keep the house and half the investment account. Sabrina would receive the other half and the cabin and the car. The $2 million in damages would be dropped. The papers would be signed and both sides would walk away with something. Mason said it was a clean resolution. He said trials are unpredictable and costly. He said I had to consider the wear and tear on my life if I dragged this out. His voice was careful, like someone explaining an obvious choice to a person who was still reeling. The offer sat in my head like a warm hand. It was tempting in the way a warm bath is tempting after a long, frozen day. I could stop. I could end the late-night planning, the endless calls, the whispers behind my back. I could put the money in the bank, paint the house, and maybe even open the bookstore cafe without the strain of a trial. Mason framed it in practical terms. You'll walk away with your home intact, he said. You'll have enough to get the bookstore off the ground and you'll avoid public spectacle. He added quietly, you could do fine by taking it. Part of me wanted to say yes then and there. My body wanted the relief more than my head did. I thought about Jenna, about Linda at the shelter, about the women who had already started calling for help. I thought about the $120,000 and $75,000 I had earmarked for them and how those gifts would become messy and complicated under a settlement. The offer would mean a compromise, a division of Graham's assets that treated his secret as legitimate in the eyes of the world. It would let him be the tragic figure again, and it would let her be the wronged lover instead of the beneficiary of his theft. Mason's words kept circling me. Trials are risky. Judges could interpret things unpredictably. Evidence can be read in many different lights. He recommended we think about the practical cost, money, time, stress. You need to ask yourself, he said, what do you want the end to look like? I turned the question over in my mouth like a coin, feeling its edges. That night, the house was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The bedroom was full of the ghosts of machines and monitors. I could still hear phantom beeps if I listened hard enough. The settlement offer was on the kitchen table beside my spreadsheet, beside the small stack of photographs I'd kept from the storage unit. The house smelled faintly of lemon from the cleaner I'd used that morning and coffee from the mug I hadn't finished. I sat at the table and watched the light fade against the windows, painting the long room in gray. For the first time since this began, the idea of ending it all without a public battle felt like an option with a human shape. I pictured signing a thick packet of papers, tucking them away in a drawer, and closing the door on the months of scrutiny. I pictured moving through a quieter life where people didn't whisper and the social media posts slowed. Maybe I could avoid being the subject of gossip at the grocery store. Maybe I could stop waking up to threat-filled voicemails. The physical wear of the fight had started to show in my shoulders and at the corners of my eyes. A settlement would be like a salve, but then I pulled out the copy of the eviction draft again and smoothed it with my palm. I thought about the way he'd prepared for my disappearance, the way he budgeted for someone else's happiness while I fed him pureed soup. I thought about Sabrina's messages, the smugness that had slipped into them when she thought I wouldn't fight. I thought about the women at the shelter who needed the money to get out of terrible rooms with terrible men. The thought of giving her half, of allowing the world to accept his secret life as his true life, felt like undoing every truth I'd uncovered. I sat there for a long time, the house changing from dusk to near dark. For a while I let myself imagine the simpler life, the one the settlement promised. Then I remembered Mason's calm look when he'd read the trust clause the first time, and the steadiness in the way he put the injunction on file. He hadn't pushed me to fight. He'd only laid out the facts and my rights. That mattered. It meant the choice was mine in a way it hadn't been when I'd been caring for Graham, making decisions in his name and with his approval. In the end, I didn't make a decision that night. I placed the settlement offer in a folder, closed it, and slid it into the drawer with the eviction copy. I made tea and sat on the porch until the stars came out. The temptation to accept remained like a low, humming ache, but it had lost its shine. It wasn't relief I wanted most, it was the truth. I woke before the sun, the house a held breath around me. For a moment I lay there, feeling the old shapes of things, the dent in the mattress where he used to favor, the faint scent of his cologne on a forgotten scarf, and let everything settle. The doubt from the night before had thinned out into something sharp and clean. I had Nikki from the shelter on my mind, and Jenna, and a small woman named Terry who called the shelter at midnight and begged for a place to sleep. The donations had already done real work. That thought steadied me. I made tea and moved through the rooms with a quiet purpose, packing the papers Mason had given me into a slim folder. I chose a simple dark blue dress, one that didn't scream grief and didn't try to say fierce either. It felt like armor because it fit without fuss. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at my face, paler than I'd like, but set. I smoothed my hair and breathed. I thought about what I would say if asked, about his heart, about what I would not say. I didn't rehearse a speech. I only promised myself I wouldn't let him decide the shape of my silence anymore. Before I left, I called Mason. His voice was steady. "You okay?" he asked, like someone who knew the weight of what comes next. "I am," I said, surprising myself with the truth. "See you at the courthouse." The drive was quiet, the town still waking. I felt oddly present, as if I were doing something simple and true, going to work not to be destroyed but to finish the thing he had started without me. The courthouse smelled like old varnish and the faint, permanent tang of heating systems. I walked in and the world outside narrowed to a single room with wooden benches and a long table. Sabrina was already there. She sat with Victor Lang, looking small and pale. Her eyes darted, but she refused to meet mine. Victor paced like a man who had practiced outrage in front of a mirror. His tie was sharp and his voice practiced for sympathy. Judge Harold Benton arrived with the slow dignity of someone who has seen too many private things made public. He wore no show of drama, only the quiet authority of someone who sits in the middle of other people's storms. Victor opened first. He spoke soft and quick, painting a picture of star-crossed lovers and promises made in whispers. He leaned toward the jury when he mentioned love, as if feeling alone at the end of a bench made people willing to forgive. He talked about Graham's clear intentions and used small, careful phrases meant to make an audience feel the romantic tragedy of it all. My stomach tightened at the ease with which he turned grief into a story he could hand out like candy. When Mason stood, he didn't try to match Victor's theater. He was plain, calm, holding the trust binder as if it were a map. He spoke about things in a way that didn't ask people to feel for anyone but to understand what was on paper. "This isn't a story about love," he said simply. "It's about a document. The document says what has to happen." He laid out the trust and pointed to the clause that mattered. He didn't need to raise his voice. The room listened because the paper was solid and the words were clean. I watched Victor's jaw tighten. The trial had started as a contest of stories, and Mason had quietly turned it into a contest of facts. Sabrina's face was a study in rehearsed grief when she took the stand. Her voice came out fragile, high, the kind of voice you hear on television when someone is supposed to be especially wronged. She talked about late-night conversations, promises of a life together, and how he had whispered the house and accounts into her hands. She sobbed at the right places. The jury leaned forward. I kept my hands on my knee and didn't look away, though I felt the room try to pull me into pity for a woman who had been, until recently, living off our money. Victor built his questions on feeling. "Did Graham ever tell you he wanted you to have everything?" he asked. "Yes," she cried. "Constantly," she said, and you could hear the conviction in her voice, the way a practiced storyteller convinces an audience of a truth that may not be true. The courtroom wanted to reach for a simple moral: love equals right. I felt the thing I had known, a deep, private betrayal, being reshaped into a tale where I could be the villain for blocking their happily ever after. Then Mason began his cross-examination. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse her of being an affair partner in front of a jury as if that would answer anything. He asked about the boutique, about when it had opened, and about who had paid its rent. He asked her who supported the displays and paid for the renovations, and she faltered. "Graham helped me," she said, small and uncertain. Mason slid a stack of bank statements across the table and pointed to a list of transfers. $42,300, he said, paid from a joint account Mr. Turner shared with his wife. The room shifted. The jury's faces changed, a little the way a photograph changes under a different light. Victor tried to catch it, to distract with feelings, but the pattern of payments was hard to charm away. Sabrina's composure cracked in thin places. She started to cry, but the tears looked fresher, as if she was surprised someone had called the numbers into the light. People clucked their tongues and leaned back. The grief story was losing its grip. When they called my name, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I walked to the stand and sat, trying to ignore the tiny creak of the wood beneath me. Victor Lang wasted no time. He came at me with the kind of focused cruelty that had probably earned him a reputation in rooms just like this. "You knew he didn't want you to have this," he said. "You knew he wanted Sabrina. You're using a clerical error to take what's not yours." His words were short, trained. He wanted me to flinch. He wanted me to look small. I didn't. I kept my answers steady because Mason had coached me, yes, but because the truth felt heavier and truer than his accusations. "I'm following the document he signed," I said. "The trust he set up names me as trustee. It requires my signature for any changes." My voice surprised me with how calm it sounded. Victor pushed, trying to frame my presence at his bedside as coercion. He asked if I had restricted his access to friends, if I'd kept him isolated. I answered plainly. "I cared for him in the way he needed," I said. "I didn't restrict his life. The evidence shows otherwise." Mason took over like a tide. He didn't preach. He walked the jurors through the binder, page by page, making all the confusing legal bits feel like simple instructions. He projected the signature page and pointed to the blank line where my name belonged. The emptiness on the page was all the power I had. "Is this your signature?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. Do you know why it's empty? Because he never asked me to sign it." The courtroom hummed with a soft, collective intake of breath. That blank line had been the hinge of everything. Then Mason did something I hadn't expected. He asked the judge's permission and read from a letter we'd kept hidden until that moment. It was the draft Graham had written, the polite eviction letter asking me to vacate within 30 days. He read the lines aloud, the mechanical calm of the words making the cruelty sound clinical. When he finished, there was a visible sound in the room, an audible gasp, small and sharp like someone hitting the underside of glass. Sabrina's face went white. Victor's carefully constructed narrative of romantic tragedy began to show the seams. The judge didn't take long. He had the look of a man who handles hard things every day and doesn't enjoy them but knows how to keep them fair. He spoke slowly, as if to give the words room to land. "This is an unfortunate set of circumstances," he said, and I felt my throat loosen. He talked about the law in plain terms, the kind of plain language that cut through the fog of stories. He said a document is binding when its terms are met, and in this case they were not. The trust required a signature that never happened. Then he said it. He upheld my authority as the trustee. He dismissed the lawsuit in full. The courtroom made a soft, disbelieving noise. Sabrina let out a small sob like air escaping a balloon. Victor opened his mouth but closed it again, his expression folding into something like resignation. I felt nothing like the fireworks you see in movies. No triumph, no shout, just a slow, settling silence that grew heavy and then steady. I stood, feeling oddly removed from my own limbs. Mason offered a small smile from across the table, the kind that said we had done the practical thing and it had worked. I nodded once to him and then to the judge, a small, private acknowledgement. Walking out of the courtroom felt like leaving a room where something had been cleaned up and put in order. Outside, the air seemed clearer. People in the hallway looked at me with a mix of curiosity and relief. I didn't look at Sabrina as I left. There was no need. The fight had been what it needed to be, and the truth had finally been the last word. A week after the judge closed the book on the lawsuit, I sat at my kitchen table with a plain white note card and a black pen. The house was quieter than it had been in years, and the silence felt less like absence and more like space. I turned the card over a few times before I wrote. It was strange how the simplest gestures felt like ceremonies now, the pen digging into the paper, the weight of the ink when I lifted it. I thought about all the things I could say to Sabrina, all the sermons and speeches I could never have said in the raw, immediate months after his death. I thought of my anger, then of my exhaustion, and finally I felt how small the need was to explain myself. I wrote one sentence, "You were his secret, I'm the signature." It felt tidy and final, like closing a box and sealing it. I folded the card and slipped it into an envelope with no return address. I walked to my car and drove to her boutique. The storefront smelled faintly of new fabric and lemon cleaner. I slid the envelope through the mail slot and felt a small, private satisfaction as the flap closed. It wasn't a shout or a confession, it was a punctuation mark. I didn't expect her to answer. I didn't want her to. At the same time, Mason had negotiated the last of the practical matters. We didn't fight over every penny of the money he'd secretly moved. That part of the story had a simple end. I asked for the funds he took from our joint accounts, and to avoid dragging things out, they agreed to return $31,000. No grand speech, no courtroom fireworks, just a check and a line on a ledger. It felt right to close that book cleanly. The repayment wasn't about money, not really. It was an accounting of fairness, a righting of a daily wrong he'd committed while I cared for him. There were scars you couldn't see, the gray at my temple, the way my hands tightened when I held a cup. I won't lie and say the fight didn't cost me. It cost nights of sleep and a kind of private peace I might never get back. But it also bought me something else, the quiet, unremarkable right to keep my home and to decide how his name would be used going forward. That was worth any sleepless night. 6 months later, the bookstore opened on a lemon-bright morning. I stood behind the glass door and watched sunlight spill across the wooden floor like something alive. The little place smelled of coffee and old paper and sea salt. We named it The Next Chapter because that felt honest. None of us were erasing what came before, but we were finally moving past it. Jenna Price ran the floor. She wore a faded denim apron and a grin that had grown wider each week since she'd started. She stacked paperbacks with care, arranged the pastries in neat rows, and greeted regulars by name. Watching her move through the shop felt like watching something heal. The cafe corner was small, 2 tables, a mismatched couch, a stack of board games, and people liked it because it was real. Locals dropped in for a slow cup of coffee and a chat. Tourists came for the view and the book recommendations. I didn't work there all day. I spent mornings there and afternoons at the house, painting a wall or planting a small herb garden by the back step. The shop could run without me because I had built a team and I trusted Jenna. She'd grown confident enough to make decisions, to call me when she needed advice, and then to set the problem down on her own. Watching her save part of her pay for an apartment felt like a second kind of victory. On the little porch above the store, I learned how to sit without thinking about machines. The wind smelled of ocean and old paper. I read in the afternoons, the sky a changing backdrop, and the sound of people laughing below was like a kind of music I had forgotten existed. Opening the store didn't erase the years of folding pill trays or the nights of watching a chest rise and fall. It just added a chapter that was mine to write. For the first time in a long while, my days included things I chose because I wanted them, not because someone else expected me to. I still run the memorial fund. I call it the Graham Turner Memorial Fund because names matter. They carry the shape of what we remember. It feels strange sometimes to say his name aloud, but I do, and I place it next to facts that help other people move forward. I volunteer at the shelter not just as a donor but as a person who can sit with someone and make a list, help with a resume, or explain what to check on a rental contract. Linda Carr greets me at the shelter like family now. She has a way of saying, "You did good," without making it sound like praise, more like a fact. I spend a few hours each week mentoring women who are nervous about forms and frightened of phone calls to landlords and employers. One woman, Mara, came in with a small child and a pile of medical bills and left with a rental application and a bus pass. Jenna sometimes brings our leftover muffins and stays to hear the stories. We talk about small, practical things: how to fill out a job application, where to find affordable childcare, what questions to ask when a landlord seems evasive. The work is quiet, steady, and it shows immediate results. Linda once told me our fund paid for 3 women to stay in motel rooms so they could escape dangerous situations. She brought me a list of names and dates and told me how each one had used the funds to start again. That list felt like a ledger of human rescue. It felt like justice. People still know my name in town now, but it means different things in different places. Some remember me as the woman who fought back. Some know me because their daughter got a bed in the shelter. A neighbor brought over a pie the first week the bookstore opened. Another sent a note thanking me for the caregiver fund that helped her sister take a breathing weekend. None of the changes were dramatic. They were small, steady shifts, little actions that added up to a different life. The revenge I wanted wasn't about spectacle. It was about steering the story he tried to write into a version that helped people he had lied to and hurt. Using his name to fund shelters and respite felt like a way of correcting the ledger. It was stubborn and public, and it meant he couldn't be remembered only as a romantic tragedy. He would be tied forever to things that helped women get back on their feet. That felt like a quiet, lasting victory. If you've ever had to rewrite a part of your life, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories like this, and if this one touched you, share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone.